Greg, what do you make about Secretary of State Pompeo and Donald Trump's remarks on their intelligence? They say they've got intelligence suggesting that the virus came from a lab in Wuhan in the Hebei province.
Well, Kieran, I think it's incredibly unconvincing what they're saying. And I would praise Scott Morrison for simply going as near as he possibly could to saying that the president is talking rubbish. I mean, Scott Morrison and Greg Hunt, these are very significant statements. They've said they've seen no evidence to support that. Now, it's beggars belief that the Americans could have produced conclusive evidence and their most intimate allies have seen no evidence to that effect. If the Prime Minister had seen American intelligence which suggested that that was true, he would have said something like, I don't comment on intelligence matters or something like that. I think Trump here and Pompeo are both being incredibly irresponsible. I was briefed on this issue at length some weeks ago by a variety of different people, and the view was that while it is theoretically possible that the virus escaped from a laboratory, that an infected bat bit a human being or something in the laboratory who didn't take proper, sanitary procedures or whatever, that's theoretically possible. It's overwhelmingly likely that the virus got moving in a wildlife wet market in the way that so many coronaviruses have done. Now, China still has an enormous culpability for not telling the world about it and for its dishonesty and trying to suppress the news and so on. But Trump and Pompeo discredit the serious charges by this conspiracy stuff. And nothing could better establish Australia's independence from the United States than the fact that Morrison and Hunt just won't follow them down that road.
And I guess vindicating the argument for an independent look at this, Greg. So while they're not following them down that road, in a way, this vindicates the statement, albeit unpopular with Beijing, but one which I think is going to generate increased international support, and that is for an international look into the origins of this thing.
Kieran, there is very great international support for an independent look at how this all got going. The British, the European Union, the Americans and so on. But to be honest with you, Kieran, I actually think Trump and Pompeo make that much harder to achieve through this. What they're doing is they're engaging in the same science fiction, fantasy conspiracies that the Chinese engage in themselves. They say that the virus was brought to China by American soldiers attending an athletic meeting. Well, that is utterly ludicrous. There's no evidence for that either. It's completely ridiculous. But the Trump and Pompeo kind of reduce the whole thing to a slanging match of, foil hats at 20 paces. And it also needlessly inflames the China-US relationship when there's already enough real tension in it. I mean, I think this is a case where Trump has the moral high ground, but by so radically overplaying his hand, actually diminishes the likelihood. I mean, if even Australia won't go down this road with him, it makes it much easier for China to say, see, this is all American conspiracy nonsense, and we're not going to have anything to do with it. I also think, Kieran, the chances of China ever agreeing to any independent inquiry that conducts any business on its own soil is zero. It's quite right that we should call for it, and the pressure for it can still have some useful outcome. It might make the Chinese come a bit clearer themselves with the information they have. But I don't think there's any prospect at all that the Chinese will say, well, we'd like to welcome a team of Swiss, French, American and Canadian, biological researchers to sweep through our Wuhan laboratories and inspect all our wildlife wet markets with, CNN and Fox News and Sky all following them around. I just think that's extraordinarily unlikely.
Indeed. And do you agree with Dave Sharma, the former ambassador and diplomat, now Liberal MP, who thinks that this spat with the Chinese embassy will be a footnote in history in terms of the two nations? Or is this a sign of a worsening, more emboldened Chinese policy towards Australia?
Well, Kieran, I'd say it's both. When I'm presented with a difficult alternative, I take the Boris Johnson option. I eat my cake and have it as well. I'd say it's both those things. It's it's a footnote because China's embassies are behaving this way right around the world. So it's not as if Australia has done something, particular to earn the ire of the Chinese. Their Chinese diplomats are behaving with just as much disregard for reality and lack of common courtesy and breach of diplomatic protocols and so on in France and Brussels and so on as they are in Canberra. However, it is also a sign of a much more aggressive Beijing. And that is very dangerous for Australia. Australia is overly dependent on China economically and exposed to China strategically. And we're dealing in a period, I still think the Americans are ultimately reliable, but we're dealing in a period where there is more uncertainty about the American strategic presence in our region than has been the case for several decades. So this is certainly a newly perplexing strategic circumstance for Australia. The ambassador himself being kind of threatening and menacing and so on, in itself, I don't think it's a tremendously important thing, but it is important in that it's a sign of a new disposition by Beijing to be extremely aggressive. And if they're extremely aggressive to Paris, that's pretty annoying to Paris. If they're extremely aggressive to Canberra, that's much more disturbing to us.